So I want to give you a bit of a history of theories of suffering. And I'm going to compare the Marxist theory of suffering to the Judeo-Christian theory of suffering. And the Judeo-Christian, and the reason I'm doing that is because I think the Judeo-Christian theory of suffering is actually one of the foundation stones of our entire culture. And so it actually matters why you think there's suffering. And so the story that describes the entry of suffering into the world, the mythological story, is the story in Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve. And basically what happens in the story of Adam and Eve is Adam and Eve are unconscious to begin with, and they're sort of in this paradisal state. There's no death, or at least there's no knowledge of death. There's also no knowledge of self. And then Eve eats the apple that the serpent gives her, and the scales fall from her eyes, and she gives the apple to Adam, and he eats it as well, so she makes him self-conscious. They both wake up. The first thing that happens is they realize that they're naked, and they cover themselves up. And the second thing that happens as a consequence of that realization is that they come to know the difference between good and evil. And I mean, that's an insanely complicated story that's dealing with a absolutely incomprehensible number of complex phenomena simultaneously, but it basically goes something like this, is that to be aware that you're naked is to be aware of your fragility and your mortality. When you have a nightmare about being naked in front of a crowd, it means that you're exposed to the crowd. All your flaws, all your mortal vulnerability is exposed to the crowd for them to see, for you to be ashamed of, for them to judge. That's partly why we're all clothed. That's partly why why clothing is a human universal. There's many human universals, by the way. Clothing is one of them, although it's used for many different purposes. So Adam and Eve cover themselves up, and so it's because they've realized that they're vulnerable. They're naked and vulnerable. That's self-consciousness. Human beings are self-conscious animals. We're really the only self-conscious animals. Other animals have the glimmerings of self-consciousness. Some of them can identify themselves in a mirror, for example, but we have whole theories of ourselves. We have whole articulated verbal and philosophical theories of what a human being is and what we each are as individuals. So really, those aren't in the same conceptual universe. It's a qualitatively different issue in the case of human beings. We're self-conscious. Self-consciousness loads on trait neuroticism, technically speaking, which means that self-consciousness is primarily something that manifests itself in the form of negative emotion. And we all know that. You're on stage, you get self-conscious. Is that a good thing? No. You can get so self-conscious that you're tongue-tied, right? It's not good. You don't want to be self-conscious on stage. Or maybe ever. You get self-conscious in the face of someone you're trying to impress. You turn all red, you stammer. It's like self-consciousness is a rough business. And it's no wonder, because you know yourself for the fragile fool that you are. And it's even worse than that, because, see, it took me a long time to figure out why it was that when Adam and Eve woke up, they also developed the knowledge of good and evil. I just couldn't figure that out. It just didn't make sense to me. How self-consciousness, knowledge of vulnerability, and the knowledge of good and evil were tangled together. Or even really what the knowledge of good and evil meant. But I figured it out eventually. I thought, oh, I get it. It was like a real revelation to me. As soon as you know you're vulnerable, you know the difference between good and evil. Because as soon as you know you're vulnerable, then you know everyone else is. And as soon as you know that everyone else is vulnerable, you know how to hurt them. And so that means you consciously know how to bring suffering into being. And that's the knowledge of good and evil. And you know that because let's say that you're really good at torturing people. And there's no doubt a number of people in the audience who are actually quite good at that. And maybe you all have a bit of an affinity for it. If you're married, I'm sure your partner would testify to that. So if you're going to hurt someone, what you think essentially is, okay, what would really hurt me? And then you think, well, I'll just do that to them. It's like, that's a good theory. It's very sophisticated. So anyways, so what happens? Adam and Eve wake up. They weren't supposed to do this. God told them that they were going to be sorry if they did that, but they did it anyways because that's what people are like. And because we always learn things that knock us out of our present paradises, right? We're curious and we won't leave things alone. And maybe things are not so bad. And then you ask some questions that maybe you're not so happy about asking once you find the answer. And you fall out of your little paradise into history and you got to work to set things right again. And anyways, God gets wind of this and and he chases Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. But he says some interesting things when he chases them out. He says, all right, now you know, what's the consequence of that? And he says to Adam, you're going to have to work. Now that's cool. That's really cool. Well, he is God after all. You know, so he knows what he's talking about. He says, you're going to have to work. So why would you have to work now that you knew you were vulnerable? Well, the answer to that is, well, if you know you're vulnerable, that stretches out into the future. You know you're going to die. You know that you're fragile. It's like maybe all your problems are solved right now. You're all sitting here. You're safe. You're not hungry. You don't want anything to drink, etc. But what about tomorrow? What about next week or next month or 10 years from now? It's like just because you got all your problems solved for this second doesn't mean you got them solved for the rest of your iterations through time. So you got to work. And the work is the sacrifice of the present for the future. And so that's exactly right. You have to work. Now you see what's interesting about that, and this is the theory that I was, and then of course God tells Eve, well, you've really, screwed things up too. You're going to have these big brain babies, and that's a big problem. You're going to suffer in childbirth, and then they're going to be dependent on you forever, and because of that, you're going to be dependent on this man that you just woke up, and that's not going to be very pleasant for either of you, but tough luck. And so that's it. That's the curse in some sense, and it's exactly right. But the thing is, there's a theory in there. There's an interesting theory of suffering that's implicit in that story, and the theory of suffering is that suffering is built into the structure of self-conscious being. It's built right into the structure. So if you're a self-conscious being, that's your lot. It isn't someone else's fault. It isn't a consequence of sociological oppression. It isn't a consequence of the fact that our society isn't organized properly. It's just part of being. All right, so that's a big deal because that's an important theory, because one of the questions is, well, why is there suffering and what are you going to do about it? And it's a lot different if it's just the way it is for you, and if it's actually your fault that he's suffering. Or maybe it's the group's fault that you're suffering. Those theories are really, really different. And then in the second story, in Cain and Abel, Cain makes sacrifices to try to get it in good with God, and Abel makes sacrifices. And the sacrifices are kind of archaic from our perspective. They're burnt offerings, so the smoke goes up where God can detect it, because he's up there somewhere. Up there where the stars are. And God rejects Cain's sacrifices, and we don't really know why, but it kind of looks like Cain is a second-rater, and then Cain goes and complains to God and says, what kind of stupid universe did you make here? I'm breaking myself in half trying to get things together, making the proper sacrifices, and nothing's going well for me. And Abel, everything he touches turns to gold. Everyone loves him. He's even a really good guy. It's so annoying. What's up with this place you built? And God tells Cain, don't be coming and telling me that the entire fabric of reality is wrong because it isn't working out for you. It says sin crouches at your door like a sexually aroused predatory cat. That's basically the metaphor that God uses. And he says, and you let it in and let it have its way with you. And that's really an interesting way of putting it, because what God says to Cain is that, you're all bitter and resentful, and really it's no wonder, because, things aren't going well for you. And then you've got Abel, who's overshining you in every way. But it's your fault. This terrible thing waited at the door, and you let it in. And then you entered into a creative union with it. And you produced something as a consequence. And that's this tormented spirit that you have now. And it's polluting your relationship with reality. And that's why things aren't working out very well for you. So go put yourself together before you come and tell me just exactly what's wrong with the structure of reality. And Cain isn't very happy about that, because really, is that really what you want to hear? It's right, you have more misery than is necessary because you really didn't put your act together, and you know it. And you've done it creatively. And so Cain goes and kills Abel. That's the story of how resentment enters the world. And it's the first story in the Judeo-Christian canon, let's say, about actual human beings. because Adam and Eve were made by God, so they don't really count. Cain and Abel were born. And so that's something, so there's a reaction to suffering, right? The necessity of sacrifice. And the consequence of the necessity of sacrifice is that some sacrifices work and others don't. And then if your sacrifices aren't met with the goodwill of God, let's say, well, then that makes you angry. Well, of course it does. And you can take God out of the story if you want, if you're not happy with that kind of mythological or narrative statement, but it doesn't really matter, because the whole point is that if you make sacrifices, especially if they're second rate, things aren't going to go very well for you, and you're going to get bitter and resentful and murderous and maybe genocidal. And it's really interesting, you know, because Cain has descendants, and if you transgress against them, they don't just kill you, they kill 7 of you, and then his later descendants kill 49 of you. There's this exponential growth of murderousness as a consequence of Cain's primal fratricide. And then the next story is the flood. And that's not an accident. There's nothing in those stories is an accident.